Good. Well, a very, very warm welcome to this evening's event, part of the ongoing online series of events that Insiders Outsiders has been organising since the beginning, well, more or less the beginning of COVID. For the small number of you perhaps who don't know about the Insiders Outsiders project, perhaps I could just start briefly by introducing myself and saying a little bit about the project before handing over to my friend and colleague Anna Nyberg in a minute. But basically, my name, as you can see from the rectangle, which I appear, Monica Bohm-Duchen. I'm the founding director of the Insiders Outsiders Festival. It took the form initially of a year-long nationwide festival designed to celebrate, but also to examine in much more detail than hitherto, in a more nuanced and perhaps also critical way, the immensely pervasive and rich and diverse contribution of refugees from Nazi-dominated Europe across all the arts disciplines, really, in terms of their contribution to British culture. And I have to say, without wanting to blow my own trumpet in any way, that the level of interest in the topic, I think Anna will agree, has exceeded our wildest expectations. And what happened with the advent of COVID, blessings in disguise, as my lovely father used to say, obviously, we wish COVID hadn't happened, but what actually happened is that the festival had mostly finished. We didn't have to change our plans very much, but the obvious next stage with so many projects, of course, was to go online. And as a result of that, the festival, or rather the Insiders Outsiders project, has been given a very rich and indeed extended and protracted and ongoing afterlife in the form mostly of online events. And for those of you who are not familiar with what we've done, if you do a search for the Insiders Outsiders YouTube channel, you will see that there are recordings on that site of a I don't know how many, Anna, now it must be many dozens of events over the last years on a very wide array of topics pertaining broadly to the subject, including the responses of the second and even third generations to their families, sort of complex and fascinating histories. So this is obviously part of that ongoing series, and it's my very great pleasure now to hand over to, let me just let in the two latecomers, to Anna Nyberg, who I think will be familiar to many of you, Dr. Anna Nyberg, who recently became a much valued trustee of the Insiders Outsiders Arts Foundation, set up to kind of support the whole enterprise. Primarily interested in the emigres in relation to design and art publishing. And I must mention, by way of sort of looking forward, that her book on the history of Thames and Hudson, of course, the premier art publisher, one of them, certainly approaching its anniversary, an important anniversary year, is going to be coming out next March. And Anna is certainly, I shall make sure she gives at least one talk to mark the publication of her book in due course. And well, Kat, I'm not going to introduce, because I'm going to hand over now to Anna to introduce Kat and to yes, be in charge. So thank you and welcome everyone.
Thank you very much. Oh, we didn't mention the questions, did we? But
yes, indeed.
Perhaps we could to encourage people, if they do have questions, there'll be plenty of time, and to say do use the chat function which we've set up. But perhaps there'll also be room for hand waving as well. But yeah, do think of questions as we go along. Right, so it's my very great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Kat Huptmann. Kat is actually German, but she's lived in the UK since 1994. Here, I think, yes, she trained as a librarian, and she worked at the Vienna Library, you probably know about this, the Holocaust Library, for 19 years. And after that, she had rather change in that she became the first archivist for the Battersea Dogs and Cats Home. A lot of you didn't know that they had an archive, but there we are. Now, since 2023, she's been the Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller, we'll hear more of those names later, Trust. She's the archivist, which is based in Senate House at the University of London. Here she's responsible for the Exile collection, and she works closely with the Research Centre for German and Austrian Exile Studies. This was founded in 1995, and at some point they started collecting papers of German-speaking refugees, and the archive is now open to donations, including on subjects such as post-war careers of the refugees from Nazism and how emigration impacted on these careers. Just to say, next year will be the Research Centre's 30th anniversary. Every year we publish a book, a yearbook, and the centre holds lots of free events and other events. I'm sure Kat's going to talk about an online exhibition, but if you're interested, do have a look at the website and have a look at the events. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Kat, who's going to talk about Das Laterndl tonight.
Hi, yes, welcome, and thank you for joining us. This is a talk about the Laterndl Theatre, but since the exhibition I created is online for you to peruse at your leisure, I'm going to talk about the Laterndl, keep it fairly brief, add some stories that I hadn't been able to include into the exhibition. Also, most of the images I'm using are different to the exhibition. I'm hoping that those of you who have already seen the exhibition will learn something new, and those of you who haven't will be inspired to check it out. There will be time for questions at the end, and also I will talk a little bit about the thinking behind the exhibition and how we plan to extend it. And then there'll be questions at the end. Before I start properly, I just want to say thank you to the current and late members of the Research Centre of German and Austrian Exile Studies for all the research they have done over the years, which formed, a lot of it formed the basis of this exhibition. I also want to thank Claire George, my predecessor, and Catherine Klinger for helping me throughout, and to the Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller Trust for funding my activities, amongst other things. I'm going to now share my screen. Hold on. Am I?
Not yet.
Not yet, no. I'm going to share my screen. Am I now sharing my screen?
Nope, still not shown up. But we know it works because we've tested it. Here it comes.
Here it comes. Okay, I'm sharing my screen. Yes, the exhibition is actually based on the Martin Miller and Hannah Norbert Miller collection, which was donated in 1998 to what was then the Institute of Germanic Studies by their son Daniel Miller. The collection comprises 13 archival boxes containing scripts, photographs, correspondence, programs about the Millers' involvement with the Laterndl and beyond. A detailed collection description for anybody who's interested is accessible via the catalogue at Senate House Library. Das Laterndl, the Little Lantern, was the most successful exile theatre in London, but you cannot imagine the Laterndl without the Austrian Centre. This is the plaque unveiled by the Austrian ambassador in 2016 at the original premises of the centre at 124 Westbourne Terrace in Paddington. About 30,000 Austrian Jews and anti-fascists fled to the UK, most arriving in the 18 months between Anschluss in March 1938 and the outbreak of war in September 1939. In London, where most of the refugees settled, self-help groups soon began to form. The Austrian Centre opened its doors in March 1939. And here you can see some images which were published in the 7-year report in 1947. The centre provided practical support for newly arrived Austrian refugees, a restaurant with home-cooked food, a variety of cultural activities, and a hostel. The hostel was first for domestic servants and later for soldiers, because a lot of them didn't have anywhere to go when they were on holiday or on furlough. The report for 1944 records about 3,500 members, which is huge. The nearest equivalent, the Free German League of Culture, only had 1,500 members at its peak. Many of the organizers were communists, but as all open political activity was forbidden to refugees, the center had to focus on cultural and welfare activities. Many of the people who benefited from the centre's many activities were probably not even aware that communists were so involved. Cultural activities were particularly important at a time when Austria had effectively been wiped from the map and the annexation accepted by the UK and other countries. And following the outbreak of war in September 1939, former Austrian citizens were subsumed into the category of so-called enemy aliens, along with German refugees. Consequently, Austrian refugees spent a lot of time and energy emphasizing their cultural differences and campaigning for an independent Austria, which probably influenced the Allied plans for Austria. In 1941, a white paper offered 4 options. Austria would remain part of Germany. Austria would be divided up between neighboring countries. This is all after the war. Austria would be part of a new Donau Confederation. And lastly, Austria would regain independence. It wasn't until the Moscow Declaration in 1943 that Austrian independence was actually assured. The Austrian Centre supported the Laterndl by providing a performance space and regular reviews and adverts in their newspaper. Der Zeitspiegel was actually had a global reach. Here's an image from the 1944 report, and you can see all the countries where people had subscribed. And there was also a scheme where it was sent on to Austrians serving in the armed forces. I was actually surprised during my research that there isn't much about the Austrian Centre in the AJR journal. No mention of its closure in 1947, nor of the plaque in 2016, even though it was the largest refugee organisation in Britain, with 3 sites in London and 1 in Glasgow. There's a great book about the Austrian Centre, but the actual archive of the centre is missing. One of the authors of the book, Charmian Brinson, during her research, talked to the son of Jenno Desser, who was the functionary responsible for winding down the centre. He remembers a lot of boxes in the hallway ready for shipping. Maybe that was the archive destined for Moscow, given the communist involvement. It would be absolutely amazing if somebody could find that archive. Soon after the centre opened its doors, 3 actors who knew each other from Vienna proposed the opening of a theatre along the lines of a small political cabaret theatre called Kleinkunstbühne, the likes of which were prolific in Vienna between 1934 and 1938. This is an image that illustrates a review of a show from the newsletter Jugend voran in 1940. The images I'm including in the talk are not necessarily as good as the one in the exhibition. I just like to say that because, of course, the best ones went to the exhibition. Fritz Schrecker, Franz Hartl, and Franz Schulz had their first meeting on the stairs in the Austrian Centre. Shortly afterwards, Schulz went to the US and Martin Miller arrived in London and joined the founding group. The first publicity leaflet for the Laterndl explained their project. I quote, the lantern continues the tradition of the Viennese Kleinkunstbühne as represented by Der liebe Augustin, Die Stachelbeere, Literatur am Naschmarkt, and the ABC. For Austrian refugees, these names would have been incredibly familiar. I quote again, these were small, inexpensive theatres producing shows which neglected luxurious scenic effects, but concentrated on wit, topical satire, and progressive outlook. They formed a vital part of the intellectual life of Austria, which was interrupted in March 1938. All the collaborators of the Lantern worked at one of those theatres. It may be hoped that the Lantern will preserve one of the characteristic forms of Austrian culture. The first show, entitled Unterwegs, On the Road, premiered at the Austrian Centre in June 1939. Like most of the shows until 1942, it was directed by Martin Miller. It opened with a light-hearted sketch about Hitler's territorial ambitions and ended with a musical parody about a day in the life of Viennese inhabitants. The first sketch was in English and the rest of the show in German. Actually, I should say that was often in Austrian dialect, and one reviewer noted that some of the non-Austrian German speakers in the audience grumbled that they couldn't understand it all. There was, however, a compere who introduced each piece in English to give all members of the audience a better chance to make sense of the content. The Laterndl continued to perform in German right to the end, which limited English visitors, although in those days it wasn't actually unusual for educated English people to speak a language or two languages. The actor Michael Redgrave had studied modern languages at Cambridge, and apparently he was a regular and became friends with the Millers. In 1942, he wrote a long letter to Miller praising Miller's performance in Volpone, one of the plays at the Laterndl. The same letter also included criticism of another play Miller was in, so he definitely meant it when he praised Miller's acting sky high. The first show was reviewed widely in the English press, including the Times and the Manchester Guardian. Reviews were very positive, and many recognized it as a new form of entertainment, as yet unknown in London. The Spectator declared, "We should be grateful to Herr Hitler for the lantern. Austria's loss has been our gain." This was the only show reviewed in the national press. Afterwards, they were mainly covered in the exile press. After 2 months, the Laterndl, like all theatres in Britain, had to close when war broke out. In November 1939, they were able to open again in new premises, this time in NW3. The second show was again a mix of sketches and songs. Most memorably, it introduced Martin Miller's famous Hitler impersonation. Miller had been well known in Vienna for his impressions, and he perfectly captured the Führer's grandiose style. One night, the BBC's head of the German section of the Political Warfare Executive was in the audience, and he arranged for Miller to broadcast his talk on the 1st of April 1940. Miller's impersonations, with some sound effects from the BBC, was so convincing that, despite the date of the broadcast, the American broadcaster CBS called the BBC to ask where they got the recording from. I'm going to play a bit of the speech for you so you can hear it for yourself. And a translation is on the screen. You can also hear the full speech, read the transcript and the translation of the recording online in the exhibition. So now I'm going to have to do some moving around. Sorry about that. Here we go.
Parteigenossen, Männer und Frauen des Deutschen Reichstags. Als im Jahre 1492 der Spanier Christoph Kolumbus, gestützt auf die Erfahrungen deutscher Gelehrter und unterstützt von deutschen Apparaten und Instrumenten, seine nunmehr bekannt gewordene Fahrt durch den weiten Ozean unternahm, konnte kein Zweifel darüber bestehen, dass bei einem Gelingen dieses gewiss gewagten Unternehmens Deutschland teilhaben müsste an den Errungenschaften, die diese Entdeckungsfahrt zeitigen sollten. Ich erkläre ein für allemal, dass unsere territorialen Forderungen in Europa nicht befriedigt sind. Darüber hinaus stelle ich nunmehr Forderungen maritimer Natur. Das amerikanische Volk ist groß und ein großes Volk will leben. Die Amerikaner brauchen einen Zugang zum Meer. Das habe ich nie bestritten. In keiner Rede, in keiner Zeile meines Buches. Aber in diesem Gebiet leben Volksgruppen, abgeschnitten von ihrer ehemaligen Heimat, mit der sie enge Bande volklicher Gefühle verbinden. Es leben in Amerika, abgesehen von den Millionen deutscher Volksgenossen, allein in Chicago 324.000 Tschechen, und die fragen sich immer und immer wieder, warum können wir denn nicht unter das Protektorat kommen, wo wir doch Tschechen sind? Es leben in New York allein 432.000 Polen, die jenem Teil Polens entstammen, der dank unserer Vereinbarung mit der sowjetrussischen Regierung dem Deutschen Reich angegliedert wurde. All diese Volksgruppen sehen begreiflicherweise im Großdeutschen Reich ihre Heimat, und sie haben auch berechtigten Anspruch auf den Schutz Deutschlands.
Yes, it's astonishing actually how alike he sounds. The BBC actually broadcast a shortened version of the speech. We have a draft of the original one performed for the Laterndl, and one of the points they cut out was that a reference to Hitler having an interest in American history and having studied Karl May. Karl May is still very well known in Germany for his adventure books set in the so-called Wild West of the US, which he wrote without ever having set foot in the UK, in America. We have another 11 drafts of speeches in the archive, with Miller as Hitler talking about air raids, addressing women, soldiers, and industrialists. At least 5 of these were broadcast on the BBC German service. They were part of a concerted campaign by the BBC to use satire as part of their propaganda war against the Third Reich. We actually have another archive another collection in our archive, which contains material broadcast by the BBC as part of this campaign. The satirical Hernschar letters by Robert Lucas, written from the front to his wife, exposed the absurdity of life under the Nazis, and they were very popular with German listeners, or with listeners in Germany who listened to the BBC in secret. Maybe this might be another exhibition, a subject for another exhibition. But it wasn't long before the Laterndl had to close again, as many of the performers, as well as large parts of the audience, were interned from May 1940 onwards. Martin Miller was actually one of the lucky ones to escape internment. He lived all the way in Putney, South London, and not having much money, he was in the habit of walking all the way to Swiss Cottage in North London. Having to leave very early in the morning to walk the 7 miles, he had already set out when the police came to arrest him. And they never bothered to come back. Over a year later, the curtain went up again on a new show in September 41. By this time, the Austrian Centre had expanded to North London, NW3, and the Laterndl was able to relocate to the centre. They opened with another Kleinkunstabend of humorous sketches and songs entitled Laterna Magica. We actually have another recording of one of the songs from that show, performed by Fritz Schrecker. It was written by Rudolf Spitz, based on his own experience working as a waiter at a Lion's Corner house. The singing is so fast I have not been able to transcribe it properly, so I've only put one paragraph on the screen, but I hope you get the gist. I'm going to play another little bit of audio, just bear with me.
Hey, waiter! Bin da, waiter dort, waiter da, waiter dort, waiter da, waiter dort, waiter da, waiter dort, waiter da. Eilig auf jeden Sinn, bin wie der Blitz so flink, was ich vergesst, sag ich es oft, so sorry oft, was ich nicht schaff, ist eben oft. Waiter, Gott auf die China Cenissimo, der Waiter ist not sorry, ich hab den schönsten Job auf der Welt, ich hab dem Lions noch gefehlt. Thanks very much indeed, thank you, sankissimo, trinken schon wieder ganz bladissimo, tragisch und komisch ist meine Welt, ganz wie das Leben, in das wir gestellt. Mancher zog als Grande aus, kommt ganz piccolo nach Haus, man lernt nicht aus, man lernt nicht aus, man lernt nicht aus, la 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 la.
The audience loved the show, but critics were demanding more serious and political content because it was now September 1941 and the situation of the war had changed completely. After Laterndl Magica, there was a definite change in the programming. There were 2 more cabaret shows, and they included much more serious material, highlighting the horrors of the war, calling for everybody to do their bit in war production, and also a play by Eva Priester, the only woman writer, which was a desperate plea for a second front to liberate political prisoners. But the serious content didn't work so well with the more humorous sketches, and there were arguments about the pros and cons of escapism for an audience consisting of refugees versus a more activist theatre. The political background to this debate was the entry into the war of the Soviet Union in 1941. This enabled communists to be openly political and to support the war effort directly. At the end of 1941, the Austrians founded the Free Austria movement, an umbrella organization strongly influenced by communists, which intended to coordinate political activities of Austrians. Signatories included prominent refugees such as the artist Oskar Kokoschka and the writer Elias Canetti, as well as Schrecker and Miller from the Laterndl. The Laterndl now focused more and more on longer plays, and any Kleinkunstabende were relegated to matinee performances on a Sunday. I have not been able to source any programs or reviews for these matinees. Maybe there aren't actually any, but it makes me think they probably did not produce any original material for these shows. This was partly probably because 2 of the most prolific writers, Königsgarten and Spitz, had either moved away or got a job at the BBC, and because their own experience of being a refugee felt less important compared to the news from the continent. Initially, the Laterndl chose plays by international authors, and there were quite a few comedies, which were very well received by the audience. This is a picture of Molnar's play at the castle, where apparently the audience laughed so much that the actors could not be heard for minutes on end. The choice of longer plays from non-German authors was hampered, though, by the difficulties of getting German translations. From April 1944, the Laterndl only performed plays written by modern Austrian authors. This was in response to the cultural policy of the Free Austria movement, whose aim was to reclaim Austrian culture suppressed or appropriated by the Nazis. It was aimed particularly at young Austrians who had not learnt Austrian culture at school. In July 1945, the Free Austria movement officially congratulated the Laterndl in their Zeitspiegel on fulfilling its duty as an exile theatre, calling it a protector and custodian of Austrian literature. By this time, the Austrian Centre had founded its own theatre group, which was taking on more political topics. The Austrian Centre Spielgruppe were mostly lay actors who performed in English. The first sketch show in September 41 was entitled Return Ticket Vienna, London, and showcased refugee life with sketches and music. Their second program was based around calls for entries for sketches by the Free Austria movement. They were actually invited to the English Amateur Dramatics Festival in 1943. And then there was the Blue Danube Club, which was keeping alive the cabaret tradition. Here are some programs from the Blue Danube, which you can buy on eBay at the moment for £49. If anybody wants to buy them and donate them to an archive, that would be wonderful. The Blue Danube Club was founded by Peter Hertz in 1941 as an unpolitical or less left-wing alternative to the Laterndl. It offered more cabaret and light entertainment, and despite the uncomfortable seats, usually sold out until it closed in 1954 when Hertz went back to Vienna. That is one of the things I haven't been able to include, but it's beyond this talk as well. There was a lot of cabaret activity, a lot of theatre activity, but and there was a lot of movement between, you know, the Laterndl people didn't just perform for the Laterndl; they sometimes performed for the Free League of German Culture, or Schrecker played at the Blue Danube after the war. So there was movement, there was collaboration. The final show of the Laterndl ended its run in August 1945. They did put on an evening of scenes and songs to a sold-out house in September of that year. But they wrote a letter to the Austrian cultural minister at the time, hoping to be able to come back to Austria. But actually, despite communist encouragement, most stayed in the UK, many working for the BBC German and Austrian services. A very few managed to establish themselves as actors on the English stage, notably Martin Miller and Lily Kahn. In 1973, the Austrian Cultural Forum put on a commemorative show. You can see the invitation here. A few of the former actors reprised their old roles. Regardless of time having passed, Hannah Norbert played a young woman again, and it was an evening well remembered by those who attended. I wish I could have found out more about this performance in '73. Again, there was no mention in the AJR about it. Two of the sketches both envisaged a future after the war. In the second one, written in 1941, the second one was, it was about a family reunion, the clash of languages, a family reunion in Vienna, and the clash of languages and customs acquired by people who had fled to different countries and continents gives the sketch a humorous tone, but little else has changed. A return to normal life in Vienna was seen as both possible and desirable as late as 1941. I do wonder what made them choose that piece, given the fact that none of the people attending had actually returned to Austria. I would like to now talk a little bit about creating the exhibition. Apologies to anyone who looked at the exhibition in the last few days, because some of the links didn't work, I noticed when I was doing this talk, but they should all be okay now. I'm not a designer or particularly techie person, but we used a tool created for archives and galleries to market their collections online. It was actually very easy to use, although I did have help from two IT-savvy individuals to make the most of the platform. My aim for the exhibition was to make it accessible to the public, i.e. to people with very little knowledge about refugees from the Nazis in the UK, while at the same time including content which would be of interest to scholars. To reach out to the widest possible audience, I initially included much more information about refugees in Britain generally. I really wanted to bring across that the refugee group, who today are rightfully lauded for their myriad contributions to Britain, were not very welcome at the time. This is an image of a meeting or a rally. The guy in the middle is Mosley. This is in Marylebone High Street, which was originally included in the exhibition. But as the exhibition got longer and longer, I realized I had to cut it right back and focus more on the Laterndl. But there are links at the end of the exhibition to give online resources that give more background. I'm not an exhibition designer, but of course, as an archivist, I got myself a book on it. And based on this, I designed each page to have the same basic structure to make it easy to take in information. Here is one of the pages. The headings had to be clear and unambiguous to let visitors know what to expect from each section, and ideally short, so they could easily fit into the side panel on the right. The images were really tricky. There are not many photographs from the time. Refugees were forbidden to have cameras, and film was expensive. Even less, of course, survived and are accessible in archives. And when you have only one image per section, it really has to count. It really has to sort of express that section. And I wanted the images to express the particular topic of the section. This image here was suggested to me by a friend. It's the author Max Hermann Neisser in Hyde Park. And I loved it right away because it makes him look so small in this, for him, new and alien city. When I requested a high image resolution from the Holding Institute in Germany, they initially sent me a different one. Here you can see them both side by side. I hope you agree that the one on the left is just a picture of a grumpy old man, and he would have had to be more important as an individual for this to be an appropriate image for the exhibition. Whereas the one on the right conveys a feeling of being overwhelmed and lost. Here he stands for so many men who had to leave behind established careers to try and start again in a new country. Another thing was the quotes. You can't expect visitors to go straight to the small print. You have to have a hook for each section to make people to want to read more. And one of the key strategies was to make it engaging was to use quotes from the time. So I only use quotes that were created or written in 33 or 40, between 33 and 45, except for the very end. It was also a way to introduce individual voices and a way to give space to what people were thinking and feeling at the time, not colored by hindsight. For example, looking at later interviews where refugees remember internment, they more often than not talk about the many cultural activities, the learned lectures by eminent professors, less so about the sheer frustration of being locked up when you want to fight. The initial quote I had was actually longer and more explicit. I am quoting, "It is not easy not to get bitter watching month by month go by, being forced to waste month by month of life senselessly. If only this ridiculous internment would make any sense." But the whole quote was much more convoluted and harder to take in quickly, so it was cut down to just the last sentence, which I hope still conveys the frustration of the writer. The images and the quotes also break down longer pages into sections, which makes it more user-friendly. Visitors are not overwhelmed by a mass of text. In regards to the order of the exhibition, I settled on a roughly chronological order. I think it makes it easy for people to follow the exhibition and facilitates interweaving the Laterndl's activities and shows with events at the time. As refugees and enemy aliens, the lives of the contributors and the audience were very much circumscribed by politics and the progress of war. I also imposed a more linear structure on the shows based on the date of the opening night. As you can see from this leaflet, shows sometimes overlapped, and they were interspersed with readings by individual actors, Martin Miller doing Krauss, his favorite author, for example, and Sunday evenings with miscellaneous songs and opportunities to dance. I hope all of the above makes the exhibition accessible to the public. The public, of course, is a big and all-encompassing, but I also had one specific audience in mind, namely the second and third generation. They usually have a much better understanding of the subject than most people, albeit often colored by family experience. But this exhibition is a way of marketing our collection to these generations, in the hope that people may consider Senate House Library as a suitable place of deposit for their family papers. It doesn't have to be Senate House Library, but if you want to get in contact, if you are thinking about donating your family papers to preserve them for future generations and make them accessible to researchers, please do get in contact, and I can still help you think through where the best place might be. I also wanted the exhibition to be of interest to scholars. Ultimately, they are most likely to use the papers for research. The exhibition has the most complete list of shows anywhere, as far as I am aware. And more importantly, I have been able to publish the programs for half of the shows. The programs should be of interest to scholars, not just because they list the contributors for each show, but also because of the adverts and short notices illustrating the establishment of businesses and services for and by refugees. And here you can see a whole bunch of these adverts for a dentist, a duvet maker, a delicatessen, of course. An early one when emigration to North America was still possible. The advert for the Indian restaurant took me by surprise, actually. That was published in 1942, and I'd only been able to find one advert for that. I don't know what your screen looks like, but if you can see photographs covering the right-hand side of the screen, you're probably missing the advert, which was repeatedly published in all the programs for indigestion tablets, which I suppose refugees are a great audience for, indigestion and anxiety tablets that deal with that. Material on refugee projects and activities are invariably fragmented, and to augment the exhibition, I reached out to other archives in the UK, in Austria and Germany. I am hoping that, as we continue to market the exhibition through events such as this one, we will be able to add the missing programs held at other archives or by second and third generation. One section I had planned, and possibly a lot of people would expect in an exhibition like this, is a section on people. The individuals who acted, directed, created the sets and costumes, composed and arranged the music, and wrote the sketches. I did compile a list of 112 contributors based on the programs that I have, which represents about half the shows. There are some well-known names and many more who only appeared once or twice, like Steffi Bitsch, who played a little girl in one of the plays in 1943, and who was the daughter of the janitor at 69 Eaton Avenue. Quite a few of the people already have their own Wikipedia entries. Others would need much more research to bring their stories to life. The Laterndl was such a collaborative effort. I did not want to focus on the well-known contributors, but I just don't have the time to do research on all of the others. If anyone out there would like a volunteer researcher post to take this on, please do get in touch. Also, I did not like the idea of a straightforward list of names. Behind each name, there is a tangle of relationships. The janitor's daughter, the married or soon-to-be married couples, the whole Knepler family, former colleagues from Vienna, political comrades. I would love to create a database and a visualization tool to explore the spatial, professional, political, and personal relationships between people who worked for the Laterndl. That would be so much more interesting and highlight the importance of relationships and networks and community for refugees. The exhibition has been online since June, and we are monitoring online usage using Google Analytics. As of yesterday, we had just over 720 users from 26 countries, which is absolutely fantastic and so much more than people actually look at the material in the archive. As you would expect, the top 3 countries are the UK, with 60% of the users, followed by the US, and enjoying 3rd place, Austria and Germany. To grow awareness of the exhibition, and thus our collections, I would like to expand the original exhibition over time, creating further marketing exhibitions opportunities. I started by adding some content, namely the Hitler parody, to commemorate Martin Miller's 125th birthday. Here you can see users, the number of new users we had in September. Martin Miller's birthday is on the 2nd of September. I published a blog, and Senate House Library put up 2 posts on various social media platforms, one on the 2nd and one on the 4th. As you can see, it actually barely registers. 2 weeks later, an email was sent out via the Austrian Centre for this talk. And you can see usage jumped up. We had 149 new users that month, more than half as a direct result of that email. Going forward, we need to do more targeted marketing and take advantage of significant dates such as Holocaust Memorial Day, so that we can benefit from the resulting publicity. As a next step, I would like to publish at least 2 of the scripts we hold. One is by Albert Fuchs, Wo liegt Deutschland? Where is Germany? Here's a picture of Martin Miller and Fritz Schrecker in that sketch. Fuchs wrote it in response to Robert Vansittart, a British politician who thought all Germans and Austrians are alike and need to be crushed and re-educated. In the sketch, a Martian visits Germany, and the play thematizes the question whether the people of a country can be equated with the government, a basic question still relevant for quite a few countries today. The other sketch is Bow Street, written in 1939 for the very first show. Bow Street was the seat of the main immigration court in central London, and the sketch highlights the difficulties and challenges the refugees faced, the uncertainty, the loss of status, and the bureaucracy involved in becoming a refugee and being able to stay. The short script is beautifully written, conveying fear, defiance, and resilience in equal measure. It is both timeless and of its time. I thought I could read something from the play, but I really haven't got the ability to do it justice. But again, the issues raised are still relevant today. I think it would make a fantastic resource for educators. It would be great to get these scripts out of the ivory tower of the archive and make them come alive again on the stage. Not necessarily as a straightforward revival, but maybe as a basis for a new play, with a group of asylum seekers workshopping the script, critiquing it and updating it with their own stories. But before I can put anything online, I need to investigate the copyright implications. Fuchs died in 1946, over 70 years ago, so there's no problem with his work. However, Bow Street is more tricky. The author, Rudolf Spitz, died in 1990, and I need to be able to find his descendants to get their permission. Spitz was married and had a daughter, Evelyn Mary Spitz. I'll be putting notices into the AJR and 2G newsletters soon to try and get in contact with her or possibly her children. Any other suggestions are more than welcome. Eva Priester wrote in her last report about the Austrian Centre, in the 6 years of its existence, the Laterndl has gone through various phases and many crises. But just like all the other immigration projects, it has persevered and has become stronger and more successful in the struggle for continued existence. I think the Laterndl was an astonishing achievement of creativity in very adverse circumstances and with barely any resources. Founded as an assertion of Austrian theatre, it did not expound a political line, but helped maintain morale in the exile community and upheld links with an increasingly remote Austria. Thank you very much. That is it from me. And I think I can stop sharing now. And are there any questions? And please take, oh yes, yeah.
Well, thank you. That was absolutely brilliant, Kat. There was so much more in there than I expected. And I particularly loved hearing about how you made the exhibition as well. You always take exhibitions for granted, don't you? That, you know, you don't really know what you're looking at. But when you explain how you present the, you know, the material to the best visual advantage and how to grab people's attention, I thought that was particularly interesting. But I'm sure, or maybe Tony wanted to say something about your interesting point about it not being in the AJR. Tony, did you, or is that just an, yeah?
I'm happy to. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, well, this is a relatively straightforward matter. The Association of Jewish Refugees was founded in 1941 in direct competition and as a rival institution to both the Free German League of Culture and the Austrian Centre. It was founded specifically for Jews who weren't mentioned in the title of either of the other institutions. In particular, the Association of Jewish Refugees disagreed totally with the policy of the Austrian Centre and the League of Culture of trying to persuade their members to return to Germany, or Austria. The AJR thought, actually quite rightly, that the last thing that most Jews would want to do would be to return to the countries where the great majority of the population had been involved either actively or passively in the extermination of the Jewish population, including family members and friends left behind. The Austrian Centre also probably would have of that I'm fairly sure, because I've seen the AJR. They were sort of newsletters sent out during the war, and they were very strongly against the policy of getting people to trying to get people to return to Germany and Austria. As you say, the great majority of the Jewish refugees didn't do so. Either stayed here or went on in some numbers to the small numbers, mostly to the States or Palestine, Israel, once the state of Israel had been founded. The AJR would also not have agreed, nor would most of the refugees from Austria, with the policy of the Austrian Centre, which in its publication Zeitspiegel tried to maintain the difference between Austria and Germany quite correctly, but by saying that that large sections of the Austrian population were not in agreement with Nazi policy, in particular anti-Semitism. Now, anybody who knows anything about what happened in Vienna after the Anschluss, let alone those who lived through it, would know that this was fiction. And also the creation, at which Zeitspiegel says quite a lot about, of a so-called Austrian Freedom Front, Österreichische Freiheitsfront, which carried out acts of active resistance against the Germans, was also largely fiction. So the organizations were basically at loggerheads. And I can only imagine that my predecessor, Richard Grunberger, who was my predecessor as editor of the AJR's monthly journal. Richard was a Kindertransportee from Vienna, and well, he lost his mother and grandfather in the Holocaust. I don't think he would have had much sympathy for this. Sorry, I've gone on.
That's right. Just that Kat, I think, wants to come in. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, it makes total sense for the early years, but why didn't they talk about the 1973 performance? Which must have been very popular. People, I mean, it was, yeah, and that took me. I found that surprising.
Yes, you're right, because the list of participants, I mean, Hannah Norbert Miller, etc., would have been well known to the AJR. That's a question I can't answer. The then editor of what was then AJR Information, Werner Rosenstock, would certainly have known of them. I mean, he was a German Jew, not Austrian. And
they were well known through the BBC services, where they worked with so many others. And
yes. You can't really answer that point.
We're running out of time. I wonder if anybody has any other questions, although you're welcome, obviously, to email.
Please, Anna.
Yes.
Anna.
Yes.
I have one for Kat. I know you circulated details some time back about the online exhibition. I wonder if you could perhaps recirculate them.
Okay.
If you could, please, that would be great.
Maybe Monica can recirculate to everybody who signed up to the talk.
Absolutely. Yes. What I'm going to do right now is actually put the link in the chat, so you can immediately click on that, so you have it to hand. That's one thing I can do without any problem at all. If I can get my act together, let me do that right.
Thank you.
Now. We can go on a little bit. I know it is nearly 7 o'clock, but by all means, if anybody else has anything they'd like to ask or say, please.
But if you put it in chat, Monica, yes. Excuse me, if you put it in chat, does that mean we have to watch it now? Or
no. If you click on it now, you should then be able to save it on your computer. It will come up on your computer for future reference.
Oh, okay, thank you.
Okay. I wonder if I could ask something on the back of what Tony's been saying. Do we know for sure, probably not, only approximately, what percentage of the obviously communist inclined, if certainly very left-wing members, both of the FGLC and the Austrian Centre, were in fact Jewish as well as left-wing and or communist? Because clearly there is this sort of intermediate position, isn't there, where you might be Jewish, but you might put your political allegiances before your Jewish identity as such? Is that something we have any statistics on at all?
Only the general one, Monica, and that I don't know if it applies here particularly, but the general rule of thumb is that 90% of the refugees were considered to be Jewish, according to the Nuremberg laws or whatever.
So in other words, there must have been a significant number of...
Yes. Oh, yes.
Yes,
Yes. Mostly, yes.
Yeah. I also wonder, Kat, and I don't know again whether you know the answer to this, but you may or may not be aware that the Hungarian refugees set up their own satirical cabaret in wartime London. And I wondered if there was any interaction. I can put you in touch because the Hungarian Cultural Centre, a few years ago now, they actually recreated the cabaret in a cabaret setting in the West End, which was quite intriguing. Are you aware of that or of any links?
No, I didn't know that.
Interesting to know if there was any sort of sense of communication between the different groups.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, there are one or two publications. I have them as links or as references in the exhibition. There is one publication about cabaret, Austrian cabaret. Some of it is still very funny, and it is very interesting to read. But it's not much of the Laterndl. It was done more by Peter Hertz, and it was more of the Blue Danube and some of the other work. So of course the scripts, we were very lucky to have some scripts, but you know, they were working scripts and they didn't have many, and you know, so much was lost.
And a very specific question actually about the rather striking graphics for the Zeitspiegel advert that you showed us. I saw some initials, I think, in the bottom left, but do you happen to know who the designer was? It's quite, you know, it's just quite a visually striking image. So
it is a very visual, yes.
Yeah.
It's an amazing image. I don't know. But I'll have a look. That is an interesting question, actually.
Ian Fell was wishing to ask a question, I can see.
Yes, Ian, do you want to unmute yourself? Thanks, Yana. No, still muted.
No, he's still.
Just click on the little red. That's it.
Thank you. I think that worked. Yeah. Yes, hello. I did a little talk last week about René Halkett, who had a Jewish wife, was involved with Laterndl in the war, and my mind has moved on to what happened after the war, because in the 8 months immediately from the middle of 1945, he was responsible for subtitling and voicing the films that they were deciding to re-educate Germany with, in inverted commas. And of course, he worked with many people, and I was very interested about 2 years ago when I discovered Kat's site and that remarkable listing of the archive, and I went through it and did something partly of a similar nature to, you know, we have online the list of people, and I was trying to break down who was involved, because René certainly used 1 or 2 people for the voiceovers that he would be drawing on the talent represented by places like the Laterndl. I first came across the reference to it in this book, which was published, 2 or 3 years ago, and there's quite a long stretch in there about it and reference to some of the people involved, but then you probably know that already. I'm trying to turn this into a question. It's a big question, really, about finding out more about the talent that was available there, and went on specifically to what René Halkett was doing, but presumably in other aspects of the media. Turn that into a question.
I know that the Research Centre published a book about all the people who worked for the BBC, and there's certainly a huge overlap there.
I didn't know that. Thank you.
There's actually a new book in, actually, no, I think it's recently published. Somebody I hadn't come across before at the University of Exeter with an interesting name. I think it's Vike something Plock, who's actually published on specifically the German-speaking service of the BBC. And I'm hoping, I don't know, Anna, whether you've come across her at all, but I'm hoping to contact her, see if she'd like to give a talk for Insiders Outsiders at some point in the future. Because clearly there is, as Ian says, there's much more, isn't there, to root out and discover. There's no question about it.
I think our yearbook's called Stimme der Wahrheit, isn't it, Tony?
Yes. I organised the conference on which that book is based. It is the German-speaking broadcasting of the BBC, and then my colleagues, Charmian Brinson and late colleague Richard Dove wrote a book which has a lot of material on the propaganda broadcasting of BBC.
Any last questions? Time is drawing on.
Again, I don't want to hog the conversation, but I was intrigued by your mention of Michael Redgrave. And I just wondered how much evidence there is of other eminent, or perhaps even not so eminent, British actors or actresses, for that matter, who were drawn or involved in some way with the Laterndl.
Oh, that's one of those questions. I think who's that actor? Olivier?
Laurence Olivier. Laurence Olivier.
Yeah, I think he was a patron.
Ah,
and
interesting.
Sylvia Thorndike.
Sybil Thorndike. Sybil
Yes.
Thorndike, also a big name.
Yes. And somebody Rainier. They were very well known at the time. Not necessarily today anymore, all of these people. And H.G. Wells went to a show, and J.B. Priestley.
Right.
So
Wow.
there were quite a few. I think that's what's so interesting about the people is the links they had with people who were like-minded, you know, not necessarily Jewish, but like-minded in terms of political terms, but also in artistic terms. And they would have these networks that definitely transcended the Austrian refugee community.
Absolutely. And that actually segues quite nicely into just a more practical point I was going to make. I don't know if you're aware of the wonderful website set up mostly by Norbert Mein for a project called Music, Migration and Mobility, where he uses interactive maps and interviews. I mean, it's a very rich resource. And I wondered, you know, I don't know if you have any contact with them, but in very practical terms, it might be a very useful project to kind of look at for ways, you know, suggested possible ways forward for yourself. It's obviously different terrain in terms of, well, no, not so different, but, you know, I think he's done it very professionally and very interactively and very much as an online exhibition should be, because it's of course very different to a physical exhibition. And now we're thinking increasingly, aren't we, about the potential of online displays and how they differ, how they can be exploited slightly differently to an actual physical exhibition. But, you know, I'm very happy to put you in touch with Norbert if you would find that useful.
Oh, no, he's a friend. Yes, he's a friend of research.
Yeah, exactly. We all know.
The only thing is with online, interactive means a whole nother level of technology. And you know what we've done, what I've done is a very basic exhibition in terms of technology. There is a little bit more that you could do possibly within the platform, but you are constrained by the framework that is provided.
There's no, okay, you can't adapt it further. You have to work with what you have.
Yes, you have to work within that framework, which is great because it's very cheap.
Right.
Anything else becomes more complicated, more expensive, and also more difficult to maintain because you have to ensure that it keeps working if you want to keep it online.
I remember we discussed that at a meeting, didn't we?
Yeah, I mean, the platform works really well, and you know, it's really good value for money.
Good enough for sure, and obviously can be built on further. Wonderful, wonderful, really interesting. Okay, I think Anna's probably right. It's nearly 7:10. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to contribute at all?
Oh yes, Jonna.
Just to thank you. This was fascinating.
Oh,
I never heard about it before.
Well, there you are. Yes, indeed. And I'm slightly disappointed, I have to say, that we haven't had more people listening in, but just to remind you, it has been recorded and the recording will be available on the YouTube channel. So do spread the word, and hopefully those who didn't actually turn up on the night, as it were, will listen to it afterwards. I think all that remains
out the exhibition.
The exhibition is on indefinitely, presumably, yes, accessible online, easily accessed. And yes, thank you very much, Anna. Thanks for chairing. Kat, thank you very much. I know you were slightly reluctant at first, but I'm very glad that you said yes. Absolutely fascinating, with again so many things linking outwards and, you know, sort of beyond the immediate subject. And thank you everybody for being here, and hope to see you again on future.
Thank you.
All the very
Bye.
good. Good night. Good night. Bye.
Bye everybody.